across the board, we seem to optimize for individuals, even though we talk about teams. And that disconnect just became blaringly obvious the more I talked with you.
Hello everyone and welcome to the iVentiv Insight series. I'm delighted to be joined today by two great patrons of the iVentiv network, Charles Jennings and Tue Krabbe-Juelsbo. Charles, who many of you that are watching this through iVentiv will know, not only as the co-founder of the 70-20-10 Institute, previously the Chief Learning Officer of Thomson Reuters, but also a founding member of the advisory board at iVentiv, a regular event chair. And Charles will be chairing an upcoming Copenhagen session where we'll also be joined by Tue, who is currently the head of leadership and talent at Nordea, a large telecoms business in the Nordics, and has previously had roles also at Leo Pharma and Alm Brands. And where we're joining today is to discuss some upcoming research that you're both working on around atomic teams, and that is why the management team, not the individual leader, is the unit that matters. Thank you both for your time today. I'm so excited that we have this chance because we've through iVentiv we've seen really how research has developed from its very kind of initial conversation through to the paper that will be coming shortly. So perhaps as a first question, I'd love to know, where did the thinking behind atomic teams emerge from?
Well, I think I'll get you to explain to her how it happened, because it kicked off after an iVentiv event.
And without spilling the beans too much, I do say that some champagne and an airport lounge was involved. No, it was actually at an iVentiv event where Charles and I kicked it off. I think you as a chair, Charles, and Basil mentioned provocatively that maybe the smallest unit of value creation isn't an individual, it's a team. And that resonated profoundly with me. And I kind of stalked you afterwards and said, we need to talk more about this, because it was also my experience, both as a doctoral researcher, but as an executive and as a leadership development professional, that most of my interventions that made sense or created real value was on a team base, a team level at least, especially when it comes to management teams. So yes, talks at the Basel event, taxi together to the airport, lounge, champagne. And that's actually where the back and forth started. Very much a teamwork.
And I think it worked in a very complementary way, in that I've been focusing for a long time on the fact that most of the activities and most of the approaches that learning and development teams take for employees overall, not just leadership teams, but employees overall, tend to be focused around individuals. And it was natural. I talk about competing priorities. We're dealing with the priorities of the HR director and the HR teams, who by their nature tend to be focused on individuals, whether it's around individual development, recruiting, onboarding, those sorts of things, or whether it's around developing individual competencies and competency frameworks and skills mapping and things like that. And the requirements of senior business leaders, which is really around functional teams to deliver the objectives and the strategy that they require. So I think that I came at it from that point of view, and Tue, you'd come at it from the point of view of looking at leadership, the challenges that we have in terms of leadership, and particularly with leadership development focused almost exclusively on individuals, whether that be through formal MBA programs or leadership so-called team development, but actually individual development within teams, coaching, those sorts of things. So we came at it from slightly different perspectives, but found that we're on the same railway tracks, basically.
And I think as an HR executive, if I can compliment you, Charles, some of the roles I've had across finance and pharmaceutical companies, it was the same thing I found. Like the way we've structured our own internal functions, the way HR basically runs is individual-based. Performance management systems, systems of record, our training programs, whatnot. Across the board, we seem to optimize for individuals, even though we talk about teams. And that disconnect just became blaringly obvious the more I talked with you. And I think I was finally able to put some thinking into words together with you.
One of the actually, one of the most galling facts that I found, and I've had thank you, exclusive early access to reading the report. And one of the statistics you shared that resonated with me is that only 28% of organisations measure team performance, despite value being created collectively, and ultimately the end goal is that it is operating as a whole. So as you work through the research, what insights or statistics perhaps stuck out for you both as well?
Do you want to go first, Charles?
Yeah, I'll just make an overall comment around that. The fact that measuring performance generally is pretty poor. I mean, we have not a very good record of measuring performance. And I always think about it in terms of a lot of the measurement, and we found this in the research, it comes out of the research as well, that often the measurement is simply on reaction. It's if you think of the old Kirkpatrick model at level 1, and how people react to usually some sort of structured, formal, time-limited intervention. And I feel it's very much like I'm sure all of us experience these days. If we order something online, if we go to Amazon or whatever online, and we're almost asked for our opinion, our review, before we open the box. Maybe, whereas there's no way you can give a valid review, an opinion about something which when you open the box, you need to actually take time. And a lot of the evaluation and a lot of the measurement is done almost at the end of some formal intervention. Did that feel good? What did that work for you? How was that great? And Tue and I have talked about this, and we've both had lots of experience of people maybe going through some formal interventions and coming back and saying that was great. I mean, I certainly have talked to people who've said that's the most life-changing thing that I've ever had. That will change exactly the way I work. That will change my life. 18 months later, we find that nothing's happened. And so it's a real challenge in terms of, first of all, measuring performance, and then identifying what are the factors that actually improve performance. Tue.
And if I can supplement that, even if you do a team-based or team-level intervention, if you don't follow up, if you don't bake that into structures and processes and continuous development of that top leadership team, it simply won't stick. Two Norwegian researchers, Bang and Middelfart, published a brilliant book and several articles about 10, 15 years ago that is seminal to some of the work Charles and I are doing. And they basically found that it almost has a negative effect 1 year after a team-based intervention things. If you don't have any kind of formal structure or process that support the leadership team in the months and years after a dedicated intervention, the effect is actually negative a year after intervention. At least it's nil or negative. So if you don't do something, you almost leave the team worse off, even though the intervention was awesome and the assessment part was golden standard and the development was good, professional consultants. If you don't then do something afterwards, it all falls apart.
And this, introspection on the team is one of the conclusions that you draw. But perhaps, Tue, you could just, mention, without revealing the full report, some of the conclusions actually that this research has led you to.
Well, we can attack this from several different angles, I think, and maybe to set it up a bit, and maybe also explain why I think both the good people of iVentiv, all the people that come to the events, and the people Charles and I meet fall into this trap of the individual is that there seems to be, across some of the peer-reviewed research we looked at, agreement that about 70% of team engagement variance traces down to a single factor, which is the individual manager. But from that single data point, we then extrapolate into something wrong, which is, well, let's then develop that individual instead of looking at the context, the relationships, and the leadership team that leader is a part of. All the big consultancy houses, McKinsey's, Deloitte, and whatnot, have done big team-level research the last 5 years. It hasn't been translated into books and other peer-reviewed science that Charles and I are doing, but they've all come to the same conclusion that the dysfunctional aspects of not attacking this from a team level, or if you do so, not following through, so to speak, leaves a lot of performance on the table. In terms of how we quantify this, but engagement, if looking at a global level, is estimated that at low team dynamic or low team engagement cost the global economy $8.9 trillion annually. However, to quantify that.
Charles.
I was just going to add, the challenge and the result of this focus on the cult of the individual essentially is costing organizations and economies huge amounts of money. It's just extraordinary what's being left on the table by not stepping back and looking at the hard research around this and thinking about how we can do this differently. And what Tue and I have delving into is the impact of what we call atomic teams. In other words, the team being the atomic unit of value, of production, of performance, of a whole range of different aspects of function within organizations.
Yeah.
And I think just to add one thing, Hannah, is that no matter how talented or brilliant the individual is that then, for instance, reads the research papers that Charles and I are doing, or read some of the consultancy reports, if you as an individual try to tackle this, you will fail. It is a relational, collaborative, dysfunctional pattern here. It's not an individual level. So no matter the excellence on the individual part, you simply can't fix it. Some interesting research came out of Institute for Corporate Performance that looked at what they call team network effects, and different kinds of teams, constellations, different kinds of networks. And they basically found that even if you have a team structure, about 80% of teams, broadly speaking, suffer from some kind of collaborative dysfunction.
Yeah. And then, Kevin and many of the others at I4CP that you reference have shared that research, and it's humbling that you see the data is there, the evidence is there, but still it seems to be this problem that people are avoiding. And an analogy that came to mind when I was reading the paper is, as of an orchestra, if you are a very good violinist, you might get up to be second string, and then you will be able to be first string, and that makes you a very good subject matter, a very good violinist. That doesn't necessarily mean that if you were to be the conductor, you would have the right skills or the right assessment to be able to have that cohesive view. And you touched on it in the paper that these these atomic units need to be seen perhaps for their intrinsic performance and value rather than the individual merits of each in the team.
It's exactly the same. The orchestra analogy can be repeated across lots of other areas. I mean, elite sport is a classic example. If we look at how elite sporting teams perform, and look at how they're developed. Of course, the individual capabilities are important there, but actually a group of very good individuals is unlikely to overcome or defeat a really well-formed team. And we've known that for years and years. And it's all about reflection. It's all about continuous improvement. It's all about looking at the components in the team and whether that team is balanced in a multidimensional way. And teams in big organizations are actually no different to putting an elite sporting team together. They all have the same issues across the board, and we can look at all sorts of other analogies as well. But I think we tend to forget that exactly the same way as for years I've contended that we tend to forget the power of reflection and the power of practice in a lot of our development. Whereas, again, looking at can you imagine a top tennis player or a top footballer or a top whatever coming off the court or the pitch and not reflecting on what happened and then thinking about what went wrong, what didn't go wrong, what will I do better next time? Those sorts of things are really, really critical. Yet we tend to, particularly in knowledge industries, we tend to forget that. And we're all under so much pressure, we think that they're not important, whereas they are the most important things that we need to do.
You referenced that in the paper, which is the importance of the management team reflecting on their own performance in the meetings themselves, not just how did we solve the business challenges that we convened to discuss, but actually did we discuss it in the right way? Did we work through the problems? Were voices heard? Did we remove bias as we go in? And perhaps to not get too much into the weeds of more metaphors, but what I found when I read it was I feel like you might have actually answered a millennium old question, which is if you replace all the boards of a ship, is it still the same ship? With Theseus's ship. So I was thinking about that when you talk about the framework that you've put together for how management teams can be truly cohesive and move the needle on some real change, which is that it doesn't actually the individuals have the potential to be more, and actually they have the potential, that team has the potential to outlast the individual, so that for the rest of the organization, for the board of the directors, for the industry itself, there is a consistency in that people understand the management team, understand the way of working through it. And you put together a framework that people can hopefully reflect on and say, are we approaching that? Maybe Charles, I'll come to you first. How did that framework come to be in the research?
Well, I'm just going to pass straight to Tue, because he's done all the work in terms of developing this framework. So I think Tue is far better placed to answer that question than me. So can I just ask you to give a
absolutely
answer?
And in all fairness, based on your thinking, Charles, amongst other places. Now, I think what we found was that even if we're deliberate, so to speak, about the practice of leadership, which is maybe a crucial thing here, so returning to a classic L&D thought is deliberate practice, and kind of taking that within, or taking into an organizational setting and turning leadership into a practice, something you can actually do, not so much adhering to or only looking at roles and responsibilities, but more the actual practice, the social practice of leadership, which I think is an underlying ontology of all the work we're doing. What came out through the research was looking at all the different, both the peer-reviewed studies, the meta-studies we found, but also some of the consultancy resources, was that they each had part of the puzzle, depending on both, of course, where they came from, their ontological stance and research backing, but also what they were selling, so to speak. And what we found was drawing from inspiration from some of the work Charles and I have done in other areas. Could be lean, it could be Kaizen, it could be some of the other process optimization frameworks and thinkings. How do we take that into a leadership sphere or domain and make that a part of that deliberate practice? And I mean, the whole notion of assessing a leadership team before you start an intervention is a good starting point. But we actually found that there must be something that comes before, which is setting the team up right, and setting the right team maybe before you even start working on it. So that led to the first phase, which was the design phase. And depending on the study, again, it's an overlooked variable, so to speak, or overlooked maybe important step on how do you set the right team up in terms of resources, mandates, competencies, skills, knowledge, abilities, and whatnot. But also, depending on the task we're supposed to solve here, what are we optimizing for? And that's also maybe alluding to you, Hannah, where we create something that's bigger than the team per se, and where I think we've all had the experience that to become a part of something lifts not only you as an individual, but of course lift the whole, and makes it into something that I couldn't have achieved alone as a star individual, but I become and grow even more, even as an A player within a team. I'm able to express and grow even more than I could have done on my own. So the first part of our team cycle or team framework here, which is an iterative framework, is the designing part. Like, how do you actually set the team up right? Then there is some kind of diagnosis. What are we supposed to develop here? And again, linking this to the organizational context, the strategy we're supposed to either develop or deploy. How do we then assess our as is and to be, or some of the more classical disciplines within the executive leadership development? But again, being researchers, how do we bring in the right kind of tools? What has a research backing? What can we actually say is a validated framework? And there's various different tools, but we want to put the tools into a context where they make sense and are not just used for episodic development. Design, diagnose, some kind of assessment from where and to where do we actually need to develop. Then the development part. How do we, on the back of a strong gold standard assessment, how do we actually develop? How do we bake this into more than just an offsite? Most of the research, again, shows that it's nice to run dog sleds. It's nice to climb mountains or do something together as a leadership team. It's just not very effective, even though it's quite costly and a lot of fun to do as a team. Like, how do we bake this into, again, drawing on some of the research and stuff Charles and others have done? How do we turn this into a deliberate procedural or processual development, step by step, into the basic works of this? And then how do you deploy it? How do you connect what you do to the rest of the organization? And it's a cycle. So I mean, deploying, connecting goes back into designing. Are we set up right in order to develop going forward?
Yeah.
So a 4-step, 4-part team cycle is what we're proposing here.
One thing you emphasize in the paper is that this also in itself is not just training that you can say, okay, we've gone through the process, tick, we're done. Is that you constantly need to be working through, as you say, it's an iterative process, moving back. If there's a new problem, if there's a new individual, if there's a new challenge, it's really about making sure that you use this to accelerate all of the other decisions.
Yes, absolutely.
It very much feeds into the whole thinking, and I think it's I don't want to call it emerging thinking because it's been around for a long time, but I think it's emerging now as a dominant understanding that learning and development is a continuous process.
Yes.
And we're seeing a lot of focus now around the importance of we talked earlier on about reflection, but about reflective practice and how we create a culture of continuous improvement, rather than thinking about the learning, thinking about the outputs, the continuous improvement process. And of course, there are some very, very well researched and well-grounded approaches around this. And I think we're seeing that, and that certainly feeds into the thinking and the work that we're doing here around, rather than having episodic development, thinking about it, how do we actually integrate that development into within the team, within the leadership team? How do we make sure that we have a culture of continuous improvement as part of that process? That's one of the critical elements.
And then perhaps in the interest of moving to deliberate practice and how to make it very much an action, most people in the iVentiv network, indeed how you both came to be part of our network, are practitioners, so heads of learning, heads of talent, heads of leadership development. I'm coming up on 7 years at iVentiv now, and leadership and executive development has been the #1 priority across our participants across those 7 years. It is evergreen. It is always top of mind. People always want to discuss it. But to your point, I think it's often talked about in how are we developing those individuals. And the research that not just in your own paper, but as you reference, is out there. It shows actually you need to approach that most senior of leadership teams and say, I don't think you're working as well as you think you are. You need to completely reset. And that can be a very uncomfortable situation or a conversation to have with the CEO or the senior decision makers. How would you suggest your peers, heads of leadership, approach their most senior leadership teams to have this conversation and getting them to think a bit more introspectively?
Well, could I just frame this? First of all, what you say, Hannah, is absolutely correct. There is leadership development is critical. It's top of people's minds. It's also where vast amounts of budget goes in terms of organizational budgets for development. It's really, really critical. And I think that what we're saying is that the research suggests that the current models that are used, when you strip everything away, are still focused on individual leadership development. It may be wrapped up in the concept of a team and so on, but actually when you get down to it, it's focused on individual development, particularly because the measurement tends to drive it, and the measurement tends to be individual. So in terms of the approach and conversations that maybe heads of talent, executive ED people and others need to take is, I think they need to bring to the table some data. Well, I know they need to bring to the table some data that shows this is what's happening. These are the likely outcomes if we continue to focus on individuals. This is the likely outcome if we move our focus to taking an atomic teams approach and lay the data out. I mean, I think that arguments are usually won by having data. If we can present data to show evidence, evidence-based discussions is really what's needed, not what feels good or what feels great. And we all know that many organizations have spent lots of time, effort, and money in terms of making people feel good, but actually in today's age, making people feel good is not good enough.
If I can add on, Charles, I'd say one size fits all is not going to cover this, of course. But start holding up the mirror and ask yourself, first of all, if you look at your top management team or any other team you want to target with this intervention or this thinking, does the task at hand, does the challenge actually require a leadership team, or is a group of coordinated individual good enough? Because if it is, don't bother, so to speak. Then there's a lot of other things you could do to optimize the workings of that and delegation communication part. But if the challenge at hand actually takes a team that works together as a team, then this might be it. Start by assessing how entrenched are you, so to speak, in this whole notion of individual systems or individual-centric development, systems-wise, processes, performance management, what counts, what is spoken of as good and valid? Is it individual star performers, or is it teams, collectives, departments? How entrenched are you, so to speak? Because that's going to determine the amount of resistance you're going to get on all levels, individual, team, or organizational level. Depending on that, you could almost use it as a map, our atomic team cycle or the model to start slowly twisting some of the interventions you're already doing. So when you talk to the HR business partners, how can you help them be better at or be smart about the design part? Like, how are you actually matching organizational challenge with the right kind of leaders, the amount of roles we need in that team, and then setting them up right? When you talk to CUEs about developing executives or leaders, what kind of tools are you using? Are they, first of all, evidence-based, of course? Are they matching the output you're hoping for, the outcome? Is there a direct link between the strategy and then the behavior the team needs, and how are you assessing that gap? So take each part of our cycle, and so to speak, and go to the relevant stakeholders. Don't necessarily expect a big bang, one-off, let's just roll it out and be happy about it. If you have a CEO or a senior leader that is curious and maybe have felt the pain, him or herself, that's usually a conversation opener. And especially if they have some experience, both from either from this organization or previous, working in a more, what you call the typical high performance team, is helping them connect with that feeling, that sense of there was something special here, special sauce, and say we can actually be systematic about working with that and put it into a system almost for how you can develop that at scale and be much, much more effective. But finding a local champion and or using this almost as a secret map to how do you then start to create an orchestrated effect might be a good way forward.
And in the paper, you include some provocative but very humbling questions that people should ask of themselves and ask of the team. And I think that also provides a good framework for the framework. As you say, you need to, it starts with a mirror of understanding what do we need to really reflect on. And from the top of our conversation, you mentioned how this collaboration came from Learning Futures Basel those years ago, through the airport, through to our call now. How invaluable and important do you find peer networks such as iVentiv for shaping ideas like this?
I think they're critical, Hannah. I've worked with lots of organizations across the world over the last 30 or 40 years. And although organizations would argue what I call special pleading, that we're special, we're very different to everyone else, actually there are common threads that run across organizations. It doesn't matter what segment you're working in, what industry you're working in, whatever. And making those connections with people who are working within organizations across different segments is really critical, because, we, as Jerome Brunner once said, our world is others. We learn from others. Without others, we're not going to go anywhere, really. So having those connections and that collaboration is really critical. And then from our own perspectives, Tue and I's current work, we're really interested to talk to people who hold roles, maybe in leadership development roles, or maybe they're working in executive development in some way, from whichever side of the fence we're looking at it. We're really interested in talking to them and learning their stories. And again, it's as my former colleague Jay Cross always used to say, conversations are the stem cells of learning. So having those conversations and making those connections are really, really critical in terms of us getting to the evidence and understanding what's happening, and then developing solutions which are actually going to work.
And I think from a practitioner perspective, having participated in several of iVentiv's events, it's by far and hands down the best network event I've had at this executive level. I mean, being exposed to seasoned champions like Charles as a chair, but also just forming friendships and forming networks across industries with peers I would have never talked to if I haven't met them at iVentiv. I mean, I still, not on speed dial, but I can still call some of my guys in Basel. I have coffee with the people I met at Novo Nordisk last time, and so it's a network that gives so much and that keep growing, and we can, for some reason, be more honest, because there's no politics, there's nothing at play here. It's just, I struggle with this. I'm working against an executive group that have these and these characteristics. What have you done? What is your experience? What play might I put forth here? And being able to share those quite tricky situations, also on a personal level, is immensely valuable.
We often reflect as a team, and I believe it was actually Jeff Glover, when he was CLO at Deloitte, that first suggested it to Russell, iVentiv CEO, of thinking about the ripples in the pond after an event. So there's the actual, that specific cohort that we bring together on 2 days. But what are the ripples in the pond as a result of that? And it's been really interesting to see some of that. It can be, there's TVs in a children's hospital in Amsterdam because we bought them for our Hollow Square and donated them afterwards. There are white papers such as this that come through from those conversations. There are connections, there are subgroups. And it's, one thing that I really set myself at the beginning of this year was, of course, focusing on the Tuesday, Wednesday program that we put together, but also thinking about what looks different on the Thursday when they go back to their offices, or 2 Mondays later at their next all hands, or a year down the line when they're reaching out to someone that they've met at an iVentiv event for this sort of peer collaboration. And to your point about that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That's what we really truly believe at iVentiv. And Charles, you mentioned you're wanting to connect with heads of leadership. Perhaps I'll take this time that if you are, if you're listening to this and that is your role or something that is in your remit, absolutely, we encourage you, please do reach out to Charles, to Tue on LinkedIn. They are open to that conversation, being part of the iterative nature of this research. And if you would like to chat about it in person, and you're free at the end of April and can be in Copenhagen, then Charles, Tue, you'll be with us for our Learning Futures Copenhagen at Carlsberg. And you can reach out to me and I can share information on that, and we would love to see you there. Thank you both for your time today. I say I'm really excited to see the development of this paper. And as mentioned, people can reach out to you for early access as soon as it's available.
Absolutely, Hannah. And we'd love to include more people, both in terms of cases, but also to bounce our thinking on it. This is how this works. It's a collaborative effort.
Yeah. So I'll leave that then perhaps as an appeal to the network. If you want to be part of this interesting, provocative, but I think, truly valuable piece of work, do reach out. Thank you both. I look forward to seeing you in person in a few weeks. And thank you to our network for listening.